Welcome to the historic blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe. Not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Story 1. Granite and Grain, the Scribes of Ancient Egypt. You are standing on the edge of the Nile floodplain. It is not the age of Cleopatra or Ramses, but a quieter, slower era, the Old Kingdom, perhaps around 2500 BCE. All around you, men dig irrigation channels, haul grain, build brick walls. But somewhere else, inside a shaded chamber cooled by limestone and stillness, a man is not moving dirt or stone. Instead, he is writing. He is a scribe, and in the slow silence of his stylus, he builds a different kind of monument, one made not of granite, but of ink, papyrus, and permanence. The bureaucracy of ancient Egypt did not rise with conquest, but with the rhythm of the Nile. Every year the river swelled and retreated, laying down silt and resetting the agricultural clock. And every year the state had to know how much grain would come, how many oxen survived the flood season, who owed taxes and how much. These were not philosophical questions. They were ledger entries written by men trained not in arms but in administration. The scribe or sesh in ancient Egyptian was both revered and mundane. He was not a king, not a warrior, not a god priest, but a cog in a massive bureaucratic machine that governed with quiet persistence. He sat cross-legged, holding a palette of black and red ink, dipping his reed brush into water and transcribing symbols onto papyrus. His world was numbers, names, land allotments, and ritual scripts. His work fed the machine of state, and through his hands flowed not just grain tallies, but the records of immortality. In the royal court and temple complexes, scribes documented everything: labor conscriptions, temple donations, flood levels, and even the number of funerary offerings delivered to a tomb. While Egypt's grandeur appears in pyramids and statues, it lived day to day in bureaucratic stability, a system so robust that its tax and grain collection continued with only modest variation for over 2,000 years. How did it all function? With hierarchy and layers much like a pyramid itself. At the top sat the vizier, the pharaoh's chief administrator, overseeing all regional governors, nomarchs, who in turn relied on district scribes. Every region reported its output, its needs, and its shortages. These were not guesses. They were reports, gathered in annual surveys and stored in archives we barely understand. One such example comes from the tomb of an official named Hesi-Ra, a high-ranking scribe of the Third Dynasty, buried in Saqqara. His tomb, though not grand, honors his office with elaborate titles carved into the walls: Chief of Dentists, Overseer of Scribes of the King's Documents, Great One of the Ten of Upper Egypt. These titles were not ceremonial. They indicated authority over written information, a domain as critical to the state as military power or priestly command. To become a scribe was no simple feat. It began in childhood. Boys primarily from the elite or administrative families were sent to special schools, often attached to temples or royal workshops. There they learned the immense complexity of hieroglyphs, and later, the more streamlined hieratic script used for everyday administration. They memorized lists of birds, gods, titles, plants, and copied out texts until their fingers cramped. Unlike in modern schools, students learned by repetition and mimicry. One famous school text, the Satire of the Trades, described how terrible all other jobs were. The potter burned by his kiln, the builder broken by stone, the fisherman stinking of the river. The scribe, it claimed, sat under shade, held a stylus, and commanded respect. Yet the reality was less glamorous. Most scribes did not write royal decrees. They counted sacks of barley, calculated rations, copied spells, or recorded the names of the dead. Their handwriting had to be perfect. Their work had to be precise. An error in a land survey could mean famine for a village or punishment for the scribe. Their tools were humble: a wooden board with inkwells, a reed brush, a papyrus scroll, and sometimes a small statue of the god thought the divine scribe for inspiration and protection. When a scribe traveled, he carried these items in a compact kit, ready to set up anywhere: beside a granary, outside a construction site, or deep within a temple complex. Even their seating was specific. Scribes typically sat cross-legged, the writing board on their lap. This posture became symbolic, so much so that statues of scribes often show them frozen in this exact position, eyes wide, brush in hand. They were seen as ever-ready, eternally vigilant, absorbing the kingdom's lifeblood, its data. And what did the state do with all these records? It preserved them. In rooms filled with clay tablets and papyrus scrolls, Egyptian temples served as both religious centers and bureaucratic archives. Some of these repositories lasted centuries, accumulating layers of information. Though many have been lost to time, their echoes remain on the walls of tombs, in fragments of papyri found in the sands, in the careful accounts of scribes long gone. The administration of grain was one of the most crucial tasks. Egypt's wealth did not lie in gold, but in wheat. Grain was currency, sustenance, and power. The scribe stood between abundance and collapse. By recording the amount stored in state granaries, calculating spoilage, and allocating rations, they enabled not just economic stability, but social order. And yet, for all their importance, scribes were invisible to most of the population. The farmer saw only the tax collector. The laborer saw only the overseer. The gods, carved in stone, seemed far removed from the man scratching figures on a scroll in the shade. But behind the scenes, the bureaucratic class worked relentlessly. The smooth functioning of Egypt, its temples, its tombs, its irrigation, its trade, all depended on the meticulous, measured work of these quiet professionals. They were, in a sense, immortal bureaucrats, not because they ruled, but because they remembered. What we know of daily life, of economic transactions, of state rituals and palace decrees, we know because a scribe wrote it down. Without their dusty ledgers and weathered scrolls, Egypt would be a blank monument, a mute colossus. With them, it breathes. But one must wonder, what did the scribe think as he wrote the name of the pharaoh for the 1000th time? Did he believe in the divine order he preserved with each stroke of ink? Or was he merely a worker, hopping for promotion, fearing mistakes, and dreaming of retirement? You rejoin the story beneath the sandstone shadows of a temple complex, where a breeze carries the dry scent of ink and incense. A scribe bends over a scroll tallying grain for the state. Another chisels names into a tomb wall, recording titles, prayers, and offerings. Though they remain faceless in our minds, these men, stylus in hand, quietly shaped an empire that endured longer than any other in human history. And they did it with paperwork. By the Middle Kingdom, c. 2050–1710 BCE, the Egyptian bureaucracy had matured into an immense and highly stratified institution. The role of the scribe had expanded. Now, it was no longer simply about tallying grain or copying hymns. The scribe had become central to the functioning of justice, taxation, temple administration, and even funerary preparation. There was a form for everything. The state's power lay not merely in military might or divine mandate, but in control of information. To record was to possess. To issue a written command with proper seals and witness was to invoke the machinery of the state, and it all depended on scribes. Some were part of the royal bureaucracy, others temple staff, and still others employed in regional or municipal roles. There were tax scribes, sesh per hesi, granary scribes, sesh per hemet, scribes of the army, and scribes of the court. A few attained the rank of overseer, supervising teams of clerks and ensuring uniformity in documentation. Egypt's state was obsessed with order mad, the divine concept of balance and harmony. The scribe was the earthly instrument of man, maintaining cosmic equilibrium by way of administrative discipline. To misrecord was to invite chaos. The bureaucracy of death. Ironically, some of the best preserved examples of scribal work come from death itself. Funeral preparations in Egypt were exhaustive and meticulously recorded. When a noble or wealthy official died, scribes compiled lists of tomb goods, counted offerings, and produced copies of the Book of the Dead, a guide to the afterlife filled with spells and moral declarations. One such scribe, Ani, whose famous papyrus resides in the British Museum today, was a scribe of the divine offerings in Thebes. His beautifully illustrated scroll over 78 feet long was not only a spiritual tool, but also a bureaucratic document, filled with certifications, spells, and itemizations required for safe passage into the next world. To the Egyptian mind, the afterlife was a reflection of the bureaucracy of life. You presented your case, argued your virtue, and showed your documentation, all to appease celestial judges. The gods were not distant deities but administrative overlords. The soul stood before Osiris with a negative confession. I have not stolen. I have not falsified. It was as if the soul stood before an audit. In this divine courtroom, the pen may have held more power than the sword, and scribes were the ones who held that pen. The chain of command. In Thebes, Memphis, and other administrative centers, scribes worked under various layers of authority. The highest-ranking officials, such as the chief scribe of the king's documents, wielded enormous influence. They handled royal decrees, supervised the archiving of temple accounts, and prepared the pharaoh's official correspondence. These scribes did not just interpret policy, they shaped it. Their detailed reports influenced how much grain a region was expected to produce, whether a priesthood received a royal grant, or if a construction crew got more laborers. The king's view of his kingdom was filtered entirely through the scribe's data. He ruled a land made of papyrus, not just stone. Below them were provincial scribes, sesh nome, who managed the complex operations of each nome or district. They were responsible for registering land ownership, crop yields, and census data. This information flowed upward not via oral communication, but written summaries, often duplicated for redundancy. Mistakes could delay tax collection or misinform military logistics. Punishments for falsifying records were severe. Corruption was both a legal crime and a cosmic transgression. Several Middle Kingdom texts warn of the moral degradation of dishonest scribes. The Papyrus of Kahun, a document from around 1800 BCE, includes instructions on how scribes should behave ethically in their roles. It recommends precision, discretion, and diligence. Still, not all was orderly. Scribes themselves could be corrupted. One fragment from the New Kingdom refers bitterly to scribes who enrich themselves with the food of the widow. Another sarcastically praises an overseer for always recording more than he collected. Where there is bureaucracy, there is exploitation, and Egypt was no exception. The role of temples. Temples functioned not only as religious spaces but as economic hubs. They owned land, employed thousands, and paid wages. Every temple had its own administrative staff headed by a high priest, but operated by a small army of scribes. One of the most complex examples is the Temple of Karnak in Thebes, which employed its own scribal school, grain storage, distribution network, and registry of personnel. These records were updated regularly. Documents included daily logs of offerings, rosters of laborers, and inventories of temple valuables. The temple economy was not a spiritual abstraction, it was tightly linked to state politics. Pharaohs used temple endowments to secure loyalty or consolidate power. Scribes acted as the invisible brokers, ensuring continuity through dynastic chaos. And when temples fell out of favor, such as during Akhenaten's religious reforms in the 14th century BCE, the scribes' records became key tools for restoration. Later kings restored old temples using archival data, revalidating forgotten priesthoods by pulling ancient deeds from temple archives. Even rebellion was bureaucratically undone. Scribal legacy and preservation. Despite their integral role, the identities of most scribes have vanished. Only a few have left behind their names, often carved into tombs. One such man was Tahotep, a vizier and moral philosopher from the 5th dynasty. Though likely not the original author, a text attributed to him, the Maxims of Tahotep, survives as one of the earliest works of ethics and professional instruction. Its advice reads like a managerial handbook. If you are a man of authority, be patient when listening to the words of a petitioner. Do not interrupt, even if he speaks nonsense. Another scribe, Jehudi, worked under Queen Hatshepsut. His tomb includes a scene of him writing under a sycamore tree, accompanied by his writing kit and servants. It shows how deeply personal and symbolic the scribal identity had become. Jehudi was not buried as a warrior or noble, but as a man of ink and thought. Why did so many scribes carve their titles so carefully into stone? Because they knew their work, though paper-thin, was eternal. While kings built monuments and priests mummified bodies, the scribe preserved the very memory of civilization. Without them, the king would be forgotten. The priest would be unrecorded, the grain uncounted. And perhaps this is why Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing, held such power in Egyptian cosmology. He recorded the judgment of souls, the history of kings, the laws of nature itself. He was the celestial scribe, a divine bureaucrat, proof that even the gods needed paperwork. But as dynasties rose and fell, as tombs were robbed and scrolls decayed, what did the common scribe make of it all? Could he have imagined that 3,000 years later, his handwriting, delicate, precise, would sit under glass in a modern museum? Could he have foreseen that the numbers he scratched onto papyrus, noting a tax owed or a land parcel transferred, would be the last surviving echo of entire families, entire towns, now vanished beneath sand? And what became of the scrolls not preserved in royal archives? How many were tossed into fires, used to wrap fish, or buried with their authors never again to be read? You find yourself once more in the shadow of a crumbling mud-brick archive. The heat presses down, but inside the remnants of what was once a granary or temple storeroom, silence reigns. A fragment of papyrus, brittle with age, sits curled beside a pottery shard bearing a few scrawled lines of hieratic. No grand monument, no gold, just ink and clay. Yet in these mundane remnants lies the soul of ancient Egypt's endurance. Its scribes, quiet, meticulous, anonymous, were the architects of a kingdom that outlived most others. And they did it without a sword. As the new kingdom, c. 1550–1070 BCE, dawned, Egypt expanded outward. With military victories under pharaohs like Thutmose III and Ramses II, the empire now reached from Nubia to the Levant. Its wealth grew, and with it, the machinery of administration grew ever more complex. The bureaucracy sprawled. Record-keeping became imperial. Gone were the days when a single scribe tallied grain for a village. Now there were thousands, overseeing construction crews at Deir el-Medina, documenting war spoils from campaigns in Syria, tracking tribute from foreign vassals, and even managing the daily schedules of royal concubines. Deir el-Medina, a bureaucracy in microcosm. Nowhere is the inner life of scribes better preserved than in the village of Deir el-Medina, home to the workers who built the tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Isolated in the desert, this state-run community was a well-oiled bureaucratic enclave. Here every transaction, dispute, and delivery was recorded. Scribes tracked attendance, ration distributions, religious holidays, tool inventories, and even interpersonal disputes. One ostrakhan, a broken pottery shard used for note-taking, records a worker's absence. He was drunk. Another reports a sick child. Still another logs a labor strike, the earliest in recorded history when food deliveries were delayed. Two famous scribes of the village, Ramos and Amenemop, left behind a trove of records, detailing everything from administrative decrees to personal letters. Their writing was clear, their tone professional, their responsibility immense. Without their detailed records, we would know little of the day-to-day reality of the tomb builders who constructed the resting places of pharaohs. These were not elite courtiers. They were civil servants bound to schedules and procedures. They answered to foremen, who answered to inspectors, who answered to thieves. The tools of the state reached into the sandiest corners of Egypt, ensuring that no grain, no tool, no man, and no god went undocumented. The enduring machine of state. Throughout Egypt's history, dynasties collapsed and reformed. The Hyksos invasion in the Second Intermediate Period, c. 1650–1550 BCE, disrupted royal continuity, but the scribal class survived. When the Nubians ruled as the 25th dynasty, they adopted Egyptian bureaucratic structures. Even under Persian and later Greco-Roman rule, the bones of Egyptian administration endured retooled but recognizable. Why did it last? Partly because the system was decentralized but standardized. Local scribes followed a consistent administrative model, but each nome district adapted it to local needs. This made the system resilient, responsive, and difficult to dismantle. Moreover, the scribe's role was not rooted in loyalty to one ruler, but in service to divine order. Kings came and went, but order remained. This abstraction allowed scribes to serve across regimes without losing legitimacy. Even in the Ptolemaic era, 305–30 BCE, Egyptian scribes continued to keep temple records in hieroglyphs and hieratic, while Greek administrators worked in their own language. Dual systems emerged, but the bureaucratic impulse to count, to record, to preserve persisted. One telling example: during Cleopatra VII's reign, scribes recorded not just rituals and offerings, but detailed tax records including a receipt for tax paid in sesame oil. Even on the brink of Egypt's collapse, paperwork flowed. Writing as immortality. Perhaps the scribes understood what they were building, not just an empire, but a memory system. Writing in Egypt was not simply a practical tool, it was spiritual. To write someone's name was to preserve their essence. This belief infused the work of scribes with a sense of eternity. If a name was forgotten, the soul perished. If it was written especially in a tomb or sacred scroll, it endured. For this reason, the scribe's role was paradoxically humble and godlike. He could bestow immortality. In many tombs, scribes included small autobiographies. These were not tales of war or conquest, but accounts of work. I was exact in my measurements, fair in my tallies, upright in my declarations. I did not cheat in my weights. I honored the king, I served the grain. These declarations, though modest, were sacred. They were a plea to eternity. Remember me not for my bloodline nor my riches, but for my records, for I kept order. I preserved truth. It is telling that the scribe of the royal army, Pentower, whose name was erased following his involvement in a conspiracy, was condemned not through execution alone, but by obliteration from record. It was the bureaucratic version of damnation. Lessons in ink and dust. What does it mean that an empire so rooted in divine kingship, pyramids, and gods was truly held together by administrators? Egypt's might was not built on conquest alone. It was sustained by clerks. And they did more than document, they enabled. Through their ledgers, they made possible the allocation of labor for pyramids. Through their censuses, they regulated food supply. Through their records of law and property, they mediated disputes. They created infrastructure through ink. The scribe's office was not glamorous, yet it was essential. Their legacy is not sung by poets or dramatized in plays, but their work, consistent, uncelebrated, and astonishingly durable, ensured that Egypt did not just rise, but endure. It is tempting today to see bureaucracy as a nuisance, paperwork, red tape, inefficiency. But in ancient Egypt it was the lifeblood of stability, a balance between chaos and order, a tool not of oppression but of cohesion. The pyramid builders are long gone. The pharaohs lie silent in sarcophagi. The gods' temples are crumbled. But in dusty archives and brittle scrolls, the scribes still whisper their quiet labor echoing across millennia. Even now, when you look at a museum display case with papyrus rolled behind protective glass and annotations beneath it, remember, this document was never meant to be art. It was a receipt, a list, a ledger, and yet it has outlasted every monument of its time. So when you sign your name on a form, calculate taxes, or archive an email, think of them. The men who sat cross-legged in linen robes, brushes in hand, recording the flow of a civilization. Is it possible, then, that the true mark of immortality is not power, not conquest, but accurate documentation? Story 2. Tablets and Taxes, the Record Keepers of Mesopotamia. Picture yourself in a low, mud-brick building, its walls sun-dried and packed with rush mats to ward off the desert heat. The year might be 2900 BCE. Outside, the Tigris River rolls past a patchwork of barley fields and canal-fed plots, each owed in part to the temple. Inside, in dim lamplight, a man presses a stylus into a soft clay tablet. Slowly, wedge by wedge, a story is written not of gods or kings, but of sheep, jars of oil, and silver weights. He is not a poet. He is not a priest. He is a clerk, a scribe, the anonymous bureaucrat of Ur. Here, in the fertile basin between the Tigris and Euphrates in what is now southern Iraq, civilization gave birth to bureaucracy. In Mesopotamia, cities rose before the wheel was fully adopted. Trade flourished. Temples amassed wealth. Fields fed thousands. And all of it required administration. It is here that writing began, not for literature, but for ledgers. Cuneiform, one of the earliest writing systems, began not as an alphabet or a way to tell stories, but as a record-keeping tool. The earliest tablets, dating back to around 3300 BCE from the city of Uruk, list items such as goats, barley, beer, and labor rations. In these tiny, hardened squares of clay, a revolution was etched. Why did writing begin with accounting? Because early Mesopotamian states were not built on conquest at first, but on resource management. Temple complexes in cities like Uruk and Eridu operated like vast economic engines. They owned land, employed laborers, and distributed goods. Priests and managers needed to track this complexity. Verbal memory was not enough. So, the stylus replaced the tongue, and clay became the medium of administration. One such artifact, known as the Kushim tablet, circa 3100 BCE, records a transaction of barley. The name Kushim appears repeatedly, perhaps the first personal name ever written. If so, the first named human in history was not a king or warrior but a bureaucrat recording grain. This fact tells us something profound about early civilization. Bureaucracy preceded empire. The pen came before the sword. The temple's need to record and redistribute surplus birthed literacy, and that literacy quickly became the backbone of urban life. The temple as administrative powerhouse. Temples in Mesopotamian city-states were not solely spiritual centers. They functioned as economic hubs, overseeing land, labor, and storage. The ziggurat loomed above, but beneath it, scribes labored in offices and courtyards, tallying goods and managing resources. Every transaction was noted. Workers received daily rations, often measured in beer and bread, recorded in token systems and later in writing. Farmers deposited grain, potters delivered vessels, shepherds registered flocks. The temple redistributed these goods as payment, tribute, or offering. To ensure accuracy, systems of measurement evolved. The mina, the shekel, the talent, all units tied to precise weights and volumes. Standardization was critical. One scribe's barley sack needed to match another tally, even across cities. The result was a proto-bureaucratic economy run by scribes. Their records weren't decorative. They had legal and religious weight. A sealed tablet could prove ownership, labor fulfilled, or debts paid. To lose a tablet was to lose one's claim. To falsify one was dangerous. And yet the system had to evolve. As cities grew and rivalries intensified, administration expanded beyond the temple. Secular rulers Ensi and later Lugal established palatial bureaucracies, paralleling the temple. The state began to tax. The rise of the tax state. By the time of the Akkadian Empire, c. 2334–2154 BCE, bureaucracy had been militarized. Sargon of Akkad, often hailed as the world's first empire builder, ruled not only by force but through centralized administration. He appointed governors, demanded tributes, and enforced census-based taxation. Scribes in Akkadian palaces recorded conscripts, rations, and plunder. Armies moved not just with weapons, but with ledgers. Victories brought not just land, but taxable subjects. Clay tablets from the time record deliveries of wine, copper, and laborers. The connection between taxation and writing deepened. The more people there were to tax, the more scribes were needed. The more complex the kingdom, the more refined the record-keeping. In Lagash, one of the great Sumerian cities, a series of reform texts from the ruler Urukagina, c. 2350 BCE, laments tax corruption. He accused officials of extorting widows and overcharging priests. In response, he standardized tax systems and limited bureaucratic abuse, the first recorded attempt at administrative reform. And what did that reform look like? More paperwork, more rules, more scribes. The tools of the trade. The Mesopotamian scribe carried no parchment or ink. Instead, he used a reed stylus and damp clay. His script cuneiform, from the Latin cuneus for wedge, was formed by pressing angles into the clay's surface. It was not easy to learn. Mastery took years. Young scribes trained in Eduba's tablet houses where they copied signs, practiced measurements, and transcribed legal formulas. These schools were rigorous. Exercises survive, showing corrections, notes from teachers, and practice calculations. The most successful scribes might enter royal service, temple administration, or even become judges. Their tools were humble, but their status was significant. In a society built on contracts, claims, and deliveries, scribes were indispensable. Even poetry and myth, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hymns of Inanna, only survive because scribes recorded them. But these were side projects. Most tablets contain receipts, orders, inventories, tax ledgers, boring to modern eyes but vital to civilization. Justice and the written word. Writing also transformed law. Oral tradition could be challenged or forgotten. A written code could be cited. Hammurabi's Code, c. 1754 BCE, one of the oldest surviving legal texts, is famous for its edicts, an eye for an eye, but behind the drama lies a bureaucratic intent. The code was a reference tool for judges and scribes. It standardized penalties, defined obligations, and clarified contract terms. Scribes thus became arbiters of justice. If a man claimed he had repaid a loan, the scribe checked the receipt. If land changed hands, the tablet sealed by witnesses and clay stamps verified the terms. The law's power lay not in its display, but in its record-keeping. And so, across centuries, from city-state to empire, Mesopotamian administration layered itself ever more specialized, ever more dependent on tablets. By the late 2nd millennium BCE, scribes could specialize, some in taxes, others in trade, diplomacy, or law. As bureaucracy deepened, so did its archives. Some sites, like Mari and Ebla, yielded thousands of tablets stored systematically, labeled, and indexed. These were not random records. They were an ancient filing system designed for retrieval. But what happens when that system collapses? When the palace burns and the archive hardens in the fire, turning thousands of soft clay records into permanent relics? Today, archaeologists treasure those accidents. But at the time, They were losses, the destruction of administrative memory. So we're left with a haunting question. How much of Mesopotamian life, how many disputes, decisions, and deeds were lost when a single clay shelf collapsed? Let us step forward a few centuries. The lowland cities have spread, now linked by caravan routes and military outposts. Dusty tablets continue to circulate, some dry and purely numeric, others bearing diplomatic correspondence. It is now the age of empires, and with empire comes complexity. As Mesopotamia transitioned from city-states to imperial polities, bureaucracy did not simply grow, it institutionalized. By the second millennium BCE, the scribal profession had formalized into a rigid hierarchy. No longer just the clerk in the temple or the grain counter in the fields, the scribe now formed the core of government. From taxes to treaties, from laws to letters, scribes were the sinews of the state. It is in this period that Mesopotamian bureaucratic life reaches new heights and leaves behind an even more detailed paper trail, if such a thing can be said of clay. The Palace Archive of Mari. On the western fringe of Mesopotamia, along the Euphrates River, the city of Mari flourished during the early 18th century BCE. It is here that one of the most astonishing archaeological discoveries was made: a massive palace archive containing over 25,000 clay tablets. These were not mythological epics or religious texts. They were bureaucratic records, reports, inventories, instructions, diplomatic letters. Most were written in Akkadian, in cuneiform script, and were addressed to or issued by the king, Zimri-Lim. What do they tell us? That the king did not rule by decree alone. Every piece of information, grain harvests, enemy movements, trade fluctuations, even weather conditions, was relayed through scribal channels. The palace operated as a kind of early data center. Runners brought reports from distant provinces, which scribes recorded and summarized. Letters were read aloud, discussed, and responded to again by scribes. One such letter, sent to Zimri-Lim from his queen, Shibtu, while he was on campaign, details shortages in rations and complaints from local officials. Her tone is brisk, administrative. She asks questions, makes suggestions, and refers to earlier memos. Their marriage, it seems, was also a correspondence between bureaucrats. Here, the image of kingship shifts. Zimri-Lim is not a warrior on horseback, but a desk-bound administrator, scanning reports and issuing commands through intermediaries. The empire, far from being a spontaneous organism, is a carefully managed machine powered by styluses and tablets. Scribal hierarchies and specialization. In the scribal schools of Mari, Babylon, and Ashur, specialization had become common. Some scribes focused on foreign correspondence, learning multiple languages and scripts. Others trained in numeric systems, able to calculate and record vast shipments of grain or silver. There were scribes for law, scribes for divination, scribes for temple accounts, and scribes for the army. Each had its place in a system that was increasingly compartmentalized. Promotion was possible, but difficult and largely dependent on patronage, family connections, and reputation. One scribe might spend his entire career recording labor hours at a single temple granary. Another might be assigned to the palace and tasked with drafting edicts. The scope of work varied, but the culture remained consistent: accuracy, legibility, and a deep knowledge of protocol. Errors were not treated lightly. A misplaced number, a miscopied seal, or a misunderstood unit of weight could disrupt entire supply chains. Some tablets even include margin notes correcting previous errors or acknowledging a scribe's unfamiliarity with a term. In essence, Mesopotamian scribes functioned much like modern civil servants. They weren't celebrities, but they were indispensable. Without them, the system ground to a halt. The Assyrian innovation: intelligence as power. By the first millennium BCE, the Assyrian Empire had become the most efficient military and administrative power the region had ever seen. Their armies were formidable, but behind their conquests lay a backbone of information management. Assyrian scribes did more than just tax and record, they gathered intelligence. From the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III onward, c. 745–727 BCE, the Assyrian state developed a network of provincial governors and informants, all of whom sent regular dispatches to the royal capital at Nineveh. These missives, written on clay tablets, were stored in organized archives and reviewed by the king's advisors. One might read, "To the king, my lord, the city of X shows unrest. Grain stores are low. The elders request permission to open emergency reserves." Another might note, "Spies report Egyptian envoys in the court of why watchfulness is advised." Through this system, the Assyrian king maintained real-time awareness of events across thousands of kilometers. It was an early form of surveillance bureaucracy, not totalitarian in the modern sense, but astonishingly effective for its time. Assyrian scribes also standardized correspondence formats. A letter began with protocol, "To the king, my lord thus says," continued with news or requests, and ended with seals and witness statements. These forms allowed for efficient processing and filing systems replicated in later empires, from Persia to Rome. It was in this era that the library, too, became a governmental tool. The Library of Ashurbanipal. Perhaps the most famous of all Mesopotamian archives was the Library of Ashurbanipal, assembled in Nineveh in the 7th century BCE. While libraries had existed in temples and palaces before, this was something new, a centralized attempt to collect and copy all known texts. Ashurbanipal, unusually for a king, was himself trained as a scribe. He read Sumerian and Akkadian and took pride in his literary learning. Under his direction, scribes were dispatched across the empire to copy works of law, medicine, astronomy, ritual, and history. These were brought to Nineveh and organized meticulously. Thousands of tablets survive. Many are duplicates, each bearing copious notes and internal catalog codes. Some include glossaries and dictionaries, intended to standardize translation between languages and dialects. What was the purpose of this vast collection? Partly it was preservation, but it was also power. In Mesopotamian cosmology, to know the name of a thing was to control it. Knowledge, especially esoteric or divine knowledge, was not neutral. It was a tool of kingship, a weapon sharper than bronze. The library thus became a symbol of bureaucratic omniscience. And yet, despite its glory, it too was buried under fire and rubble when Nineveh fell in 612 BCE. The tablets survived charred and scattered, preserved not by intent, but by destruction. The fragility of the written state. It is tempting to imagine Mesopotamian bureaucracy as eternal, a self-perpetuating machine. But it was not immune to collapse. With each passing generation, scripts evolved, languages shifted, and systems changed. By the late first millennium BCE, cuneiform had become arcane, known only to temple scholars. The rise of Aramaic, with its more flexible alphabet, gradually replaced the wedge-shaped script that had defined an entire civilization. Still, the legacy remained. The idea that a state must document itself, that rule requires records, had taken hold. Later empires would build on this legacy. Babylon fell, Assyria crumbled, but the archive lived on. And yet, we return to a simple paradox. These thousands of tablets, meant to be ephemeral, temporary records of goods and orders, have become the most enduring voices of Mesopotamian civilization. The temples have vanished, the palaces are ruins, but the inventory list survives. Now the winds have shifted. The empires that once buzzed with activity have grown quiet. You walk through the cracked foundations of a Sumerian temple or an Assyrian administrative complex. Scattered in the dust are broken tablets, shards of writing that once held the full weight of law, labor, and governance. It is the long twilight of Mesopotamia. but in these remnants, the legacy of its bureaucracy whispers on. This final section turns our gaze to what remains not only in the literal sense, through archaeology, but in influence, in echoes. For while the scribes of Ur and Nineveh no longer press styluses to clay, their systems and the logic behind them still shape how we govern, measure, and record. Let us now reflect on the waning of cuneiform, the transformation of the bureaucratic tradition, and the long shadow cast by clay tablets into the present day. Cuneiform's decline and the rise of the alphabet. By the 6th century BCE, cuneiform was no longer the dominant script of the Near East. The script that had birthed the earliest administrations was gradually being replaced by alphabetic systems more efficient, less complex, and usable by a broader segment of society. The Aramaic script, with its compact 22 characters, spread rapidly under the Achaemenid Persian Empire, c. 550–330 BCE. Royal edicts under Darius I and Xerxes were still carved in cuneiform Old Persian, but everyday administration shifted to Aramaic. It was faster, more flexible, and required less training. The scribal schools that had once trained elite bureaucrats in hundreds of cuneiform signs fell into disuse. Fewer students learned the complex web of sumerograms and Akkadian grammar. By the 1st century CE, cuneiform had vanished entirely as a living script. Its final known inscription, in Hatra, modern-day Iraq, dates from around 75 CE. Ironically, the writing system born to eternalize transactions and names did not preserve its own future. But its bureaucratic function endured adapted, translated, reinvented. The archive as political power. One of Mesopotamia's most lasting contributions is the idea of the archive as an instrument of governance. No longer just passive storage, archives in Mesopotamian states were active tools used to assert control, maintain order, and communicate authority. Each level of government, from local temple administrators to royal courts, maintained its own records. These were not private documents. They were accessible to appointed officials, and they provided proof of land claims, of ration entitlements, of legal decisions. Mesopotamian archives influenced the Achaemenids, who maintained regional archives across their vast empire. Later, the Greeks and Romans would inherit and adapt these concepts. Roman bureaucrats, for instance, kept copies of census data, tax records, and military rosters. The word tablet even survives in Latin as tabula and into modern usage in the form of the English table and French tableau. Thus, the Mesopotamian principle that a government must document its people and resources in physical form became a permanent fixture in imperial practice. The everyday bureaucrat, a forgotten hero. It is tempting, when reviewing the fragments of Mesopotamian history, to focus on the kings, Gilgamesh, Hammurabi, Sargon. But these names, large as they loom, are known to us primarily through the work of anonymous scribes. The man who wrote the Epic of Gilgamesh likely never met royalty. He was a copyist, trained to reproduce myth as part of a temple curriculum. The clerk who recorded Hammurabi's laws was not a legislator, but a bureaucratic technician. The scribe who tallied 83 jars of sesame oil in a provincial storeroom likely did not ponder his place in history, and yet, that tablet may be the only surviving evidence of that town's existence. There is something profoundly humbling about this. In modern societies, bureaucracy is often maligned as dull, obstructive, tedious. But it was bureaucracy, not monarchy, that preserved civilization's core functions. The Mesopotamian scribe was not glamorous, but he ensured that laborers were paid, disputes were settled, resources were tracked, and memory was preserved. Their legacy is one of resilience, continuity, and understated significance. Rediscovery and decipherment, a second life in modern times. For nearly 2,000 years after the fall of cuneiform, the script and its meanings were lost to the world. Tablets collected dust in the ruins of buried cities Nineveh, Ur, Nippur, Babylon. No one knew how to read them. That changed in the 19th century. Excavations led by British and French archaeologists brought thousands of tablets back to London and Paris. Scholars like Henry Rawlinson and Edward Hincks, using trilingual inscriptions such as the Behistun inscription, carved into a cliff in western Iran, began the painstaking process of decipherment. By the early 20th century, cuneiform was readable again, at least to specialists. And suddenly, a forgotten world re-emerged. Not just myths, but laws, leases, inventory lists, school exercises, and tax records. To archaeologists and historians, this was a revelation. Mesopotamia was no longer just a biblical curiosity or a vague prelude to Greek civilization. It was a fully articulated administrative culture, deep, rich, and meticulous. And all of it had been documented on clay. Today, more than 500,000 cuneiform tablets survive. Most remain unpublished. Each one is a snapshot of bureaucracy in motion, and many are still waiting to be read. Lessons from the tablets. As we reflect on the administrative genius of Mesopotamia, what enduring lessons does it offer? First, that the written record is the foundation of enduring governance. Rulers come and go, but ledgers provide continuity. A stable bureaucracy, even amid dynastic turmoil, offers a civilization its best chance at survival. Second, that specialization and training are key. Scribes were not amateurs, they were deeply educated professionals. The idea that civil servants require training, oversight, and ethical standards finds its earliest form here. Third, that data is power but also responsibility. The same system that ensured fair distribution of barley could also enable exploitation. The scribes of Lagash recorded corruption as well as justice. Bureaucracy, like any tool, reflects the values of its users. And finally, that memory is fragile. The scribes of Mesopotamia did everything they could to preserve transactions, traditions, and truths. Yet without interpretation, without a living tradition, even the most carefully recorded data becomes silence. They taught us that civilization is not built solely with monuments or weapons, but with lists, with standard forms, with stamps and receipts. Even the smallest of tablets, tucked into a linen bag and shelved behind a temple storeroom, had the potential to outlive its maker by millennia. So next time you fill out a form, submit a report, or email a spreadsheet, consider this. You're part of a legacy older than writing itself. You are in some small way the inheritor of the scribes of Sumer, the bookkeepers of Akkad, the archivists of Ashur. Their world is dust now, but their ledgers endure. And isn't that, in its own quiet way, a form of immortality? Story 3. Mandate of Ledgers, Bureaucracy in Han Dynasty China. The year is 141 BCE. The yellow river glints in the spring sun, winding its way through fields and walled towns. In the capital of Chang'an, a city of orderly streets and crimson-roofed halls, a clerk dips his brush into ink. He copies a directive onto a bamboo slip. The message is short but vital, an update on land assessments in a western commandery. In a modest building not far from the imperial palace, his supervisor folds the document into a leather case, ties it shut, and sends it to the next bureau for review. A report, among thousands, and yet each one a thread in the vast, intricate web of Han administration. This was not a land ruled only by swords or divine mandate. This was an empire bound together by writing not etched in stone, but brushed onto bamboo, silk, and eventually paper. It was a world where order emerged not from spontaneity, but from formality. A world where the emperor's power was expressed not just in edicts, but in payrolls, land registries, census records, and law codes. The Han Dynasty, 206 BCE, 220 CE, did not just inherit China, it organized it. Let us begin where most empires begin, with geography and need. The need for organization. When Liu Bang, later Emperor Geazi, emerged victorious from the ashes of the short-lived Qin dynasty, he faced a paradox. The Qin had unified China through ruthlessness, building roads, walls, and standards, but their rule had collapsed within a generation. Harsh laws, forced labor, and brutal bureaucracy left a bitter memory. The Han founders needed stability, but without tyranny. They knew that governing an empire stretching thousands of kilometers across rivers, deserts, and mountain ranges required something stronger than charisma. It required structure. Enter the bureaucracy. Unlike the Qin, the Han did not completely centralize. Instead, they created a hybrid. Commanderies Jun directly controlled by the imperial court, and kingdoms Guo nominally ruled by imperial relatives. Over time, the commandery system expanded and the emperor's reach deepened. But the real mechanism for control wasn't military garrisons or royal blood. It was the bureaucratic class, the men who copied, counted, registered, and reported. Their tools were humble: bamboo slips tied with cords, ink made from soot and glue, brushes trimmed from animal hair. Their offices were plain, often located within granaries or adjacent to local magistrate halls. And their work never finished. The mechanics of Han bureaucracy. At the top sat the emperor, son of heaven, but he did not rule alone. He was supported by the three excellencies, San Gong, the chancellor, the imperial secretary, and the grand commandant. These men oversaw the civil, judicial, and military functions of the state. Beneath them was a latticework of 9 ministers, each responsible for areas such as justice, rights, taxation, and imperial supplies. Together, they coordinated the empire's complex needs, and beneath them, tens of thousands of lower officials carried out their orders. These officials were ranked according to a formal salary grade system, measured in Dan Chinese letter of grain. The highest earned 10,000 Dan annually. Local clerks might receive only 100 or 200. This system created both incentive and hierarchy. Promotion was possible but rare. Mistakes could mean dismissal or worse. There were civil service examinations in rudimentary form, but many early Han officials were appointed through patronage, local reputation, or family connections. Still, literacy and administrative skill were essential. A clerk who couldn't tally taxes, write legal decisions, or record property disputes had no place in government. And what were they recording? Everything. Censuses taken regularly counted not just households, but individuals, livestock, tools, and fields. Land taxes were assessed based on acreage and yield. Labor obligations were tallied and scheduled. Local crime reports were submitted to commandery officials, then to the capital. One surviving wooden slip from the border commandery of Juyin lists provisions issued to soldiers on patrol: 3 gin of grain, 1 flask of wine, 1 pair of straw sandals. Another tablet records the population of a village: 63 households, 274 individuals, including 49 men eligible for service. These records, dull on the surface, were the arteries of the state. Through them flowed data, and from data came decisions. The role of clerks and local officials. The most numerous administrators were county magistrates, Zionling, and their clerks. These were the direct interface between the state and the people. They handled civil disputes, coordinated corvée labor, oversaw local education, and managed the collection of taxes both in kind, usually grain, and in labor. Magistrates were often educated elites, trained in Confucian classics, expected to embody both legal expertise and moral authority. Their clerks, meanwhile, were the paper pushers, indispensable but often uncelebrated. Clerks did the copying. They managed the document flow, issued certificates, calculated grain quantities, and ensured the stamps and seals matched. Every official document required authentication, usually with red ink impressions and binding cords. One broken seal could invalidate an entire record. Failure to follow protocol could result in more than just rebuke. Hand law was explicit. Intentional misrecording of data or mishandling of official documents could result in corporal punishment. In severe cases, demotion or exile followed. Bureaucracy was not a suggestion, it was law. Yet in spite of these threats, the bureaucracy functioned with remarkable continuity. Clerks learned from their elders. Forms were standardized. Copies were made for redundancy. Instructions from the capital were transmitted through relay stations, with new messengers posted every 10 li. A commandery archive might contain thousands of bamboo slips, bundled and stored upright in ceramic jars or wooden boxes. Every month, these records were reviewed, categorized, and summarized for the higher offices. It was a continuous feedback loop, from center to periphery and back again. Communication and standardization. How did the hand maintain consistency across such a vast land? The key was standardization, a legacy inherited from the Qin. Standard units of measure, currency, and even writing style were enforced. Official documents followed rigid formats. Margins were regulated. Language was formulaic. Certain verbs and phrases were reserved for the emperor's voice. Instructions came in stages: edicts zhao, memorials zhu, inquiries wen, and official replies fu. Each had a distinct tone and expected response. Bureaucrats were trained not only to write, but to read appropriately, knowing how to interpret a directive without overstepping. Even calligraphy mattered. Neatness reflected virtue. Sloppy writing was seen not only as a clerical error, but a moral failing. After all, how could one who did not respect the written word respect the law or the people? This attitude extended to archiving. Documents were tied in bundles, labeled carefully, and shelved in cataloged sections. In Chang'an, the imperial secretariat employed full-time archivists, men who never issued a single decree, but who ensured no decree was lost. Through all this, we see the shape of a state that did not survive by conquest alone. The Han dynasty's longevity over 4 centuries owed much to its ability to record, to respond, and to revise. It was a government of brush and bamboo, as much as of emperor and army. And yet one might wonder, did the clerk in Juyin, brushing out his 50th tax report of the month, understand the role he played in holding the empire together? Or did he simply fear the next audit? The brush hovers above the bamboo slip, waiting for ink to settle into the bristles. The clerk has done this many times. Before him lies a pile of census reports from village headmen, each listing names, ages, land holdings, taxable livestock, and more. His task is not creative, it is confirmatory. He cross-references the headcount with the previous year, checks household totals, and verifies the grain yield estimates. Then with a practiced motion he writes, "Verified, to be compiled." There is no grandeur here, no royal drama or military campaign. But this desk, this pile of slips, is the quiet foundation of imperial power. The hand census, counting souls and fields. Few bureaucratic functions so clearly illustrate the administrative depth of the Han dynasty as its census system. From early in the dynasty, emperors commissioned household counts at regular intervals. The goal was not philosophical, it was fiscal. The Han taxed people poll tax, land acreage tax, and labor corvée. Knowing exactly who owed what was a matter of necessity. Each household who Chinese letter submitted a registration to the local office. These included names and relationships of all family members, ages to determine eligibility for taxation or service, occupations, farmer, artisan, soldier, merchant, land holdings and the type of land, irrigated, dry, mountainous, draft animals, tools, and livestock. The data was tallied at the village level, verified by county clerks, then compiled by commandery administrators. Eventually, the figures made their way to the capital, where imperial statisticians reviewed national trends. The results shaped everything. Conscription quotas were set from adult male populations. Tax grain, a major source of revenue, was estimated by acreage and expected yield. Corvée labor schedules were planned, ensuring construction projects had sufficient workers. Surviving records from sites such as Julian and Yumen Pass in the Gansu corridor offer concrete examples. These desert outposts were far from the centers of power, and yet their administrative forms are precise, dated, and consistent with those found elsewhere. A single surviving form from 15 BCE lists the following. Household of Zhao Chun, 5 members, 2 adult males aged 23 and 26, 3 dependents, land 3 mu irrigated, 2 mu dry, 1 ox, eligible for corvée. Every word here determined how Zhao Chun would live for the next year, how much he would owe when he would work for the state, how he would be judged if a dispute arose. The state did not know him personally, but it knew him statistically, and that, in the logic of the Han, was sufficient. Corvée and labor service, administering the body. Beyond taxes in kind and coin, the Han levied a corvée system, unpaid labor required of adult males. This labor was central to maintaining roads, canals, palaces, and frontier defenses, including the expansion of the early Great Wall. How was this system administered? Each man's obligations were tied to his age, location, and past service. Local clerks maintained service ledgers, noting when a man had completed his assigned days. A record might read, Yu Feng, age 28, completed 40 days of corvée in the 3rd lunar month, assigned to road repair between Pingshu and Jinyang, tools provided by the state. These work details were not ad hoc. They were scheduled, logged, and rotated. Some laborers served in local projects, others were sent hundreds of miles away. The state, in turn, issued supplies, food rations, clothing allowances, sometimes tools. All were noted, all were accountable. Corruption of foremen withholding rations, for example, was documented and punishable under statute. The efficiency of this system made massive infrastructure projects possible with minimal cost to the treasury, but it also demanded relentless record-keeping, legal documents, and daily bureaucracy. The Han legal system was deeply intertwined with its bureaucracy. Judges were often magistrates, and evidence was frequently documentary. If 2 families disputed a land boundary, the deciding factor was often a written deed, not eyewitness memory. These deeds, held by both parties and copied by county clerks, were official and carried the weight of law. Similarly, tax receipts, loan contracts, marriage agreements, and inheritance claims were all written, often in duplicate or triplicate, with seals, witnesses, and official notations. From the Zhangjiashan cache, a group of bamboo texts recovered from a Western Han tomb, we see legal codes outlining bureaucratic procedure. Officials were personally liable for misfiled reports. Ignoring required formats or deadlines could lead to flogging or demotion. Officials were required to retain records for a set number of years before authorized destruction. The bureaucracy, in other words, was governed by bureaucracy. Paper, a quiet revolution. By the Eastern Han period, 220 CE, a significant development began reshaping administration, the widespread adoption of paper. Though earlier dynasties had used bamboo slips and silk, both had limitations. Bamboo was bulky and heavy, silk was expensive. Around the 1st century CE, officials began using paper made from mulberry bark and hemp rags, following innovations attributed to Kai Lun, a court eunuch. Early Han paper was crude but transformative, lighter than bamboo, easier to store, quicker to inscribe. Its adoption didn't happen overnight, but by the end of the dynasty, it was becoming common in lower-level administration. Paper would eventually reshape bureaucracy, allowing for more extensive archives, faster communication, and a quieter, more portable administration. One imagines a clerk, perhaps in 100 CE, smiling slightly as he replaces a heavy bundle of slips with a folded sheaf of new material, easier to write on, easier to file. Change, even in bureaucracies, sometimes comes with subtle joys. Discipline and ethics of the civil servant. What did it mean, ethically, to serve in the Han bureaucracy? The Confucian ideal was gaining prominence especially under Emperor Wu, r. 140–187 BCE, and the bureaucracy increasingly absorbed its values. Officials were expected not just to be efficient, but morally upright. Documents from the Yantilun, Discourses on Salt and Iron, a policy debate recorded in 81 BCE, include criticisms of bureaucrats who had become overly focused on form over substance, or who profited from their posts. The Han government responded by establishing training, issuing handbooks, and promoting moral exemplars officials who were praised in court records for integrity, humility, and fairness. One official, Du Shi, was noted not only for introducing water-powered bellows to improve iron smelting, a technical innovation, but for refusing bribes and reducing local tax burdens through accurate reassessment. Such men became models. Their names were recorded in dynastic histories not for conquest, but for correct paperwork. Bureaucratic collapse, warning signs. But as the dynasty aged, so too did its institutions. By the late 2nd century CE, corruption had crept into the ranks. Posts were increasingly purchased, appointments sold to the highest bidder. Factions in court used the civil service to reward allies and punish rivals. The burden of taxation grew heavier on peasants, while wealthy landowners found ways to register under false names or underreport acreage. Censuses became less reliable. Rebellions like the Yellow Turban Uprising of 184 CE often targeted corrupt magistrates and unresponsive officials. The bureaucracy, once the lifeline of the empire, began to fray, not because the system was flawed, but because its ethics eroded. Paper and ink remained, but virtue had faded. The Han bureaucracy was not perfect, but in its height, it was a marvel of coordination, consistency, and care, a rare achievement in ancient governance. And as we consider its complexities, we might ask, can a state truly endure if its ledgers are accurate but its leaders unjust? Or must ethics and administration rise together? We return now to the capital, but it is no longer the city of bustling archives and regulated appointments. Chang'an is fading. The great Han dynasty is nearing its end, not with a single battle but with 1,000 small failures, missed tax reports, falsified records, unfilled posts, and corrupt assessments. Yet even in decline, the scribes still work. In county halls, brushes still copy family registers. In military garrisons, slips are bundled and sealed. In temple offices, officials draft appeals to the court. The bureaucracy has outlived emperors before. Can it survive the collapse of the empire itself? This final section reflects on the fall, endurance, and legacy of Han China's administrative system. It is a story of continuity amid chaos, and of how a civilization's bureaucratic habits became one of its most enduring contributions to global governance. The crisis of late Han administration. By the late 2nd century CE, the Han bureaucracy had lost its grip. Natural disasters, internal rebellions, and factional struggles at court disrupted the smooth operations of administration. Grain shortages, often resulting from locust plagues or floods, placed pressure on local officials to supply relief, but with dwindling resources and inadequate support from the center, they faltered. The Yellow Turban Rebellion 184 CE, often treated as a purely religious uprising, was in part a reaction to failed bureaucracy. Local magistrates had grown detached, some corrupt, others simply overwhelmed. When state relief was slow or absent, resentment festered. In the capital, eunuchs gained increasing control over appointments. Competence was replaced by loyalty. Bureaucratic posts were sold, undermining the very meritocratic ideals Confucian scholars had hoped to instill. Even as the bureaucracy continued to function on the surface documents copied, taxes recorded its authority eroded. The center could no longer enforce oversight across the empire's vast periphery. Commanderies became increasingly autonomous. Regional warlords filled power vacuums. By the early 3rd century, China fractured into 3 kingdoms, each with its own court, policies, and administrative reforms. The Han dynasty, for all its organizational brilliance, could not survive the loss of moral legitimacy in its administrators. The brush may have remained steady, but the hand behind it trembled. What remained? Bureaucracy after the empire. And yet, the collapse of Han did not erase its bureaucracy. When the Cao Wei, Shu Han, and Eastern Wu states emerged in the Three Kingdoms period, 220–280 CE, they inherited much of Han's administrative machinery. They used its census models, taxation frameworks, and even its rank and salary system. Reforms were made. Some regions returned to stricter centralization. Others experimented with local autonomy, but the bones of the Han state remained. Moreover, later dynasties, such as the Jin, Northern Wei, and eventually the Tang, all referenced Han as the standard for administrative order. Manuals compiled by Han officials were copied and preserved in state libraries. Training schools used Han-era examples to instruct new clerks. The idea that governance was rooted in the careful, moral handling of documents had taken permanent root. One might even say that the ideal of the Chinese state as a highly literate, centrally coordinated, ethically grounded administrative system was born in Han and never truly disappeared. Indeed, it would be refined and institutionalized even further under the Sui and Tang, with the full development of the imperial civil service examination system. But the foundations were Han. Writing as statecraft, the philosophy behind the pen. What made Han administration more than just a system of paperwork was its philosophical undercurrent. From the reign of Emperor Wu onward, Confucianism became the ideological backbone of the civil service. Officials were not just expected to be competent, they were to be virtuous. Moral rectitude became a standard not only for behavior but for the correct handling of documents. This belief that good governance flows from good character elevated the role of bureaucracy to near sacred status. Records weren't simply data, they were acts of service. To misfile, to falsify, or to delay, a report was not just a bureaucratic error, it was a moral failing. This attitude led to an administrative culture where form and ethics intertwined. In later dynasties, this evolved into the examination-based appointment system, but the Han had already built the ideal, a scholar official whose duty was to society, not to power. As such, even during periods of disunity or invasion, Chinese regimes often preserved the administrative class. Conquering states co-opted scribes. In some cases, they were the only form of continuity across dynastic change. The pen, or more precisely, the brush, was as resilient as any wall. The fragility and immortality of records. Yet for all their precision and durability, the physical records of Han bureaucracy have only partially survived. Most were written on bamboo slips which rot and decay. Others were on early paper, more fragile still. Silk documents were expensive and rare. In damp or unprotected environments, these materials disintegrated. Still, significant caches have been discovered in Juyin, Dunhuang, Zhangjiashan, Yinwen, and other locations, often buried intentionally or preserved by dry desert conditions. These finds reveal not grand proclamations, but routine entries. Grain inventories, tax receipts, corvée assignments, weather reports, laws and administrative codes. Together, They sketched the outline of a civilization that prized documentation over display, governance over grandeur. Where other empires left stone monuments, Han left ledgers. And in their quiet accumulation, those ledgers tell us more about how people lived, worked, obeyed, and rebelled than any statue or battlefield. Legacy in the modern world. The DNA of Han bureaucracy persists today not just in China, but in any system where civil service, census data, and record-keeping form the infrastructure of governance. The emphasis on written communication, regional reporting, salary-based officialdom, and ethical administration foreshadows modern public administration. Even the rank system based on grain allotments parallels modern notions of government pay grades. In China, the continuity is particularly direct. Tang, Song, Ming, and Qing bureaucracies all drew upon Han-era concepts. The reverence for official documentation, the prestige of the exam-based scholar official, and the function of the central archive all trace their lineage to Han innovations. Han, in many ways, was not just a dynasty, it was a template. Final reflections. The scribes of Han China, their names largely forgotten, held the empire together not with weapons or riches, but with consistency. Their tools were simple: brush, ink, bamboo. Their tasks were repetitive, often thankless. Yet they enabled an empire of over 60 million people to function for centuries. They taught that governance is not glory. It is routine. It is form-filling. It is ensuring the grain is delivered, the census is complete, the soldier receives his winter coat. In the end, we remember the emperors, but it was the clerks who made their rule possible. And perhaps that's the quiet truth buried in the records. Civilization is not built by the loud, but by the meticulous. So the next time you submit a form, file a report, or enter data into a system, know that you're echoing the movements of a Han clerk 2,000 years ago, steady, silent, and essential. Story 4. Scrolls in the Sand, the imperial clerks of the Persian Empire. The wind moves across the ruins of Persepolis, sweeping through column bases and stone staircases. Once, this was a city humming with administrators, scribes, translators, accountants, and supply clerks. Now it is quiet. But beneath the surface, literally hundreds of thousands of administrative documents once lay buried, pressed into clay and sealed with reeds, each one a silent voice in the chorus of a great empire. This is the Achaemenid Persian Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE. Stretching from the Aegean to the Indus, it was, at its height, the largest empire the world had yet seen. It encompassed dozens of languages, cultures, climates, and currencies. How was it held together? Not through force alone. The Persians built roads, yes. They stationed garrisons. But above all, they built paperwork. This was an empire where scrolls and seals mattered as much as swords and chariots. The Achaemenids governed through an extraordinary and surprisingly flexible system of bureaucracy, and in its heart stood the scribe, the administrator, the functionary, and the archivist. Let us step inside the administrative world of ancient Persia, not the golden throne room, but the mud-brick office with reed pens and ink-stained hands. The shape of the empire. The Achaemenid administrative system did not emerge all at once. Cyrus laid the foundation, conquering Babylon in 539 BCE and adapting its bureaucratic customs. But it was under Darius I r 522–486 BCE that the empire became truly systematized. Darius divided the empire into provinces, or satrapies, each governed by a satrap, regional governor, responsible for collecting taxes, overseeing security, and managing local affairs. These satraps had autonomy but were monitored closely, often by the king's eye, a royal inspector who traveled incognito. Each satrapy maintained its own bureaucracy. Reports flowed upward, edicts flowed downward. But how did this communication happen across such immense distances? Enter the Persian royal rode a 2,700 km route from Sardis to Susa, studded with relay stations where messengers changed horses and handed off scrolls. A message could travel from the western edge of the empire to the capital in a matter of days. The empire's efficiency impressed even outsiders. The Greek historian Herodotus, not one to praise Persia lightly, remarked, "There is nothing mortal faster than these messengers. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness of night prevents them from completing their appointed course." That quote, centuries later, would adorn the walls of the U.S. Postal Service. Writing and language, a multilingual machine. Unlike many empires that tried to enforce a single language, the Achaemenids embraced linguistic pluralism. This was a necessity in an empire of over 50 million people, encompassing Elamites, Babylonians, Egyptians, Lydians, Greeks, Medes, Armenians, and Indians, among others. Administrative documents were produced in Elamite, Aramaic, Old Persian, and later Greek. Each language had its role. Elamite was the primary language of record-keeping at Persepolis, likely because of the local scribal tradition. Aramaic, the lingua franca of the Near East, became the standard language of communication across satrapies. Old Persian, used in royal inscriptions, had limited administrative use but conveyed imperial ideology. Babylonian cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphs continued to be used in local contexts for continuity. Scribes were often multilingual. At Persepolis, tablets show that Elamite scribes translated oral reports into writing, sometimes from Persian or another local tongue. Many scribes held titles such as interpreter or scribe of rations, reflecting both linguistic and logistical roles. The Persepolis Fortification Archive, bureaucracy in clay. One of the most remarkable discoveries in understanding Achaemenid administration came not from grand temples or royal tombs, but from a pile of debris near a wall in Persepolis. In the 1930s, archaeologists uncovered over 20,000 clay tablets and fragments now known as the Persepolis Fortification Archive. Dated primarily to the reign of Darius I, these documents represent a staggering bureaucratic system in motion. What do they record? Distribution of grain, beer, wine, oil, animals, and textiles. Assignment of rations to workers, soldiers, and officials. Movements of royal envoys and their support. Religious offerings and materials used in state ceremonies. Administrative instruction and records of supplies received. Each tablet was sealed with a distinctive stamp, often multiple seals, to verify different stages of authorization. Some were written in Elamite, others in Aramaic. Many include personal names, job titles, destinations, and precise quantities. One tablet, for instance, might read, 5 measures of beer issued to the workers on the Palace Canal project, month of Tashritu, overseer, Bagadata. Another might document, 1 donkey, 10 measures of flour, and 1 skin of wine issued to the courier traveling from Susa to Sardis. These weren't glamorous records, but they were essential. They allowed the imperial court to manage a vast logistics system across thousands of kilometers, with local scribes ensuring supplies moved efficiently, were accounted for, and did not fall into unauthorized hands. In essence, the Fortification Archive is not a story, it is an accounting spreadsheet in clay, spanning hundreds of years. The role of the imperial clerk. What did it mean to be a scribe in Achaemenid Persia? Unlike in Egypt or China, scribes in Persia were more function-specific. A clerk might be responsible solely for grain rations, or transport animals or temple offerings. Others handled correspondence, royal logistics, or military provisioning. These were trained professionals, often literate in multiple languages, and operating within highly localized offices. In some provinces, scribes used ink and parchment, in others, clay and styluses. In Egypt, for example, scribes continued to use papyrus and hieroglyphs in temple bureaucracy under Persian rule. Most scribes were not noble, but they were respected. Inscriptions sometimes name them, praising their role in keeping order and supporting the king's justice. One might wonder, did they see themselves as imperial agents, or just workers tallying supplies? Did they feel loyalty to the king, or simply to the rules and routines of their office? Perhaps both, or neither, but without them the empire would not have functioned. The Achaemenid system was a triumph of distributed administration, a network of localized record-keeping, tied together by fast communication and trusted procedure. But for all its brilliance, a question lingers. How long can an empire survive when its scrolls are burned, its messengers silenced, and its clerks scattered? Let us step deeper into the empire, not into its capitals, but into the regional centers, outposts, and provincial halls, where much of the Persian Empire's bureaucracy truly operated. It is here, in dusty storehouses, busy satrapal courts, and way stations along imperial roads, that imperial control was transformed into practice. The Achaemenid Empire was not simply large. It was complex, a web of ethnicities, economic systems, and local traditions. Its genius did not lie in the obliteration of these differences, but in their coordination, and the glue that bound the system together. Bureaucracy facilitated by scribes, clerks, seal-bearers, and messengers. The satrapy system, regional government with central accountability. The Persian Empire was divided into roughly 20 to 30 satrapies, depending on the period. Each satrapy had a satrap, provincial governor, often a noble appointed by the king, a military commander, to prevent concentration of power in one person, a royal secretary or treasurer, often sent directly from the court, a corps of scribes and accountants who maintained the satrapy's fiscal and legal operations. This layered structure was designed deliberately. The satrap had wide authority, collecting taxes, judging disputes, managing infrastructure, but he was constantly watched. Reports flowed back to the royal capital. Inspectors known as the King's Eye, likely modeled after Median traditions, traveled without warning, auditing accounts and reporting misconduct directly to the king. The balance was subtle. Satraps could amass enormous wealth and patronage, but if they veered too far from loyalty or began to hoard power, the bureaucracy had built-in checks. A famous example, Megabyzus, satrap of Syria, was reprimanded by Artaxerxes I for exceeding his authority. Though powerful, his actions were documented, reviewed, and ultimately constrained by the central system. Taxation and tribute, bureaucracy in gold and grain. Perhaps the most famous administrative feat of the Achaemenids was the system of provincial tribute. Darius I implemented a standardized taxation policy known through Herodotus, who recorded tribute amounts for each satrapy. The system combined in-kind and monetary contributions. Egypt might supply grain and papyrus. India provided gold dust. Bactria sent horses. Babylonia shipped barley and dates. Lydia, famous for its silver, paid in coin. But how was this enforced? Each satrapy maintained accounting offices, where scribes logged incoming goods. Tax quotas were assessed annually or seasonally. Scribes compared estimates against harvest reports and previous year's totals. Shortfalls had to be explained: crop failure, raids, shipping delays, and these justifications were filed. The Persepolis treasury tablets offer direct evidence of this process. For example, in the month of Anamaka, 30 sheep and 12 goats received from Ushtanu for the rations of the travelers from Sardis, inspected by Urjuma, sealed by Mithridata. Each name was traceable. Each seal was verified. This wasn't arbitrary extraction, it was administration by the rule of scroll. And what happened when tribute wasn't delivered? Penalties could range from reduced privileges to military intervention, But in many cases, negotiation and documentation came first. Governors could appeal assessments. Central administrators would send emissaries to verify conditions. The system had flexibility, but also discipline. The seal as signature, verification in an age without signatures. One of the most distinctive features of Persian administration was the widespread use of seals. Clay tablets were often inscribed while soft, then rolled with cylinder seals or stamped with signet rings. Seals functioned like signatures but with far more visual richness. Each was unique, often depicting mythological scenes, animals, or abstract patterns. Some bore inscriptions naming the owner. Types of seal usage included approval of a ration record or tax form, authentication of royal edicts or travel permits, closure of storage vessels or grain bins, guarantees of purity for gold, silver, or textiles. A document without a seal was incomplete. A broken seal could imply tampering. Seals from different officials layered on a single document indicated multi-level review, much like a form passing through several offices today. One tablet might show Seal 1, the issuing clerk. Seal 2, the supervising scribe. Seal 3, the satrap's treasurer. Seal 4, the courier who confirmed delivery. Each seal served as a thread in a web of accountability. Communications and couriers, the speed of administration. A bureaucracy is only as strong as its communication. The Persian system excelled in this regard. Messages between the court and the provinces traveled along the royal road and related arteries, supported by relay stations. Known as puridazish in Old Persian, these couriers were elite messengers, often government agents who carried scrolls, sealed pouches, or verbal reports. Each station along the route provided fresh horses or mules, resting quarters and food, security from bandits or local disruption, archives of travel permits or past communications. The system allowed for reliable, trackable correspondence, which was essential for maintaining the unity of such a vast and diverse empire. And unlike many contemporary powers, the Achaemenids respected local languages and traditions in communication. A royal message might be issued in Old Persian, then translated into Elamite, Aramaic, or Babylonian, ensuring comprehension at every level. Local archives and regional memory. Satrapal capitals and palace centers kept extensive archives. These included tax records and ledgers, personnel files on local officials, inventories of temples, fortresses, and storehouses, legal rulings and land grants, ritual records and sacrificial tallies. Sadly, most of these have been lost, burned, buried, or eroded, but fragments remain. The Persepolis tablets, Babylonian contracts under Persian seal, Egyptian tax documents with Aramaic annotations. Together, they suggest a system that prized documentation over display and coordination over conquest. It wasn't just about keeping control. It was about knowing what was owed, who had paid, who had failed, who had died, who had fled. In a world without digital databases, this was knowledge managed one clay tablet, one sealed scroll at a time. In these records, we see the lifeblood of empire, not the glitter of gold, but the ink of labor. But what happened when the seals fell silent? A clerk folds a scroll. He seals it with his ring and sends it down the chain. It bears a message from a satrap's accountant in Sardis to a royal auditor in Susa. The text is simple: quantities of tribute received, rations dispersed, names of couriers and dates of delivery. It is not urgent, but it is important. It is how the empire knows itself, not through speeches or conquest, but through continuous, quiet, accurate writing. And yet empires fall, seals crack, scrolls burn, clerks disappear. What happens when the pen outlives the power? In this final section of Story 4, we explore the fall of the Achaemenid system, not only its destruction, but its strange endurance. For even after the palaces were looted and kings dethroned, the rhythms of Persian administration persisted in Babylon, Egypt, Anatolia, and beyond. It is a story of bureaucratic resilience, of clerks adapting to new overlords, and of systems remembered long after their rulers were forgotten. The fall of the empire. The Achaemenid Empire began to falter under Xerxes I.R. 486–465 BCE, whose reign was marked by heavy taxation and unsuccessful military campaigns, most famously the wars against Greece. Yet despite these setbacks, the bureaucracy endured. Scrolls still moved. Rations were still counted. Later kings like Artaxerxes II and Darius III struggled to maintain control as satraps grew more autonomous. The empire weakened from within. Still, the scribes persisted, documenting shipments, court orders, and building projects. But no amount of administration could stop the rise of Alexander the Great. In 330 BCE, Alexander marched into Persepolis. His soldiers, awed by its beauty and overwhelmed by resentment, burned the royal palace. Whether as revenge for Persian invasions of Greece or as a drunken accident, the fire consumed not just a symbol, but a working archive. We will never know what was lost. Legal records, family histories, inventories, correspondences, the soft infrastructure of empire. Gone in hours. And yet, the bureaucracy itself did not vanish. Continuity under new masters, Alexander and the Seleucids. Alexander was not merely a conqueror, he was also an opportunist. He understood that to rule Persia, one must govern like a Persian. He retained many Persian officials, married into local nobility, and even wore Persian dress. He continued the use of satrapies, preserved taxation systems, and allowed scribes to continue their work, sometimes under Macedonian supervision, but often without interruption. When Alexander died in 323 BCE, his empire fragmented. One of his generals, Seleucus I, took control of Persia and Mesopotamia, founding the Seleucid Empire. Despite their Hellenistic overlay, the Seleucids inherited and preserved the administrative DNA of the Achaemenids. Tax records were still kept in Babylonian cuneiform in some cities. Aramaic continued as the language of administration. Satrapies, though renamed, still operated under familiar rhythms. The form survived, even as the empire's identity changed. Legacy in other cultures, from Persia to Rome and beyond. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder wrote with some admiration of the Persian state's organizational prowess. The Roman cursus publicus, a system of imperial couriers, bore striking similarities to the Persian royal road and its relay stations. In fact, Roman road networks and communication protocols may have drawn direct inspiration from Persian precedent. In the East, the Achaemenid model helped shape Parthian and later Sasanian administration. While distinct in religion and style, these empires retained the satrapal system, continued the use of imperial seals, and expanded on the idea of state archives. Even later Islamic bureaucracies, such as the Abbasid Caliphate, maintained administrative divisions, record-keeping practices, and archival logic that bore traces, however diluted, of Persian systems. The use of scribes, katib with defined ranks, centralized diwan offices, and standardized taxation had historical depth far older than often recognized. The clerk in history's shadow. And what of the scribes themselves? The names of most are lost. A few are preserved in seal impressions or scribal notations. Artapanu, who issued barley rations. Mithridata, who certified a shipment of oxen. Datums, who verified the passage of a messenger. These men were not aristocrats. They did not lead armies or shape policies, but they translated the empire into a functioning system. They reconciled numbers, ensured travel permits were honored, and recorded the flow of resources so that someone far away in Persepolis, Susa, or Ecbatana could make decisions. Their humility is their significance. They were the threads that held the imperial tapestry together, invisible but essential. Clay and memory, what survives? So much was destroyed. The archives of Persepolis were burned. Regional collections, especially those stored on perishable scrolls, are gone. But clay tablets hardened by fire survived by accident. The Persepolis Fortification Archive, the treasury tablets, and scattered Babylonian administrative texts offer glimpses of a vast system. Each record is small but cumulative. A list of beer rations for laborers, an inventory of animals for sacrifice, a log of supplies issued to temple workers, a travel permit for a government official, a record of tribute from the province of Bactria. These are not epics, they are not declarations of war, they are ordinary, and that is what makes them extraordinary. They capture the mechanics of empire day by day, clerk by clerk. When modern scholars reconstructed the administrative life of the Achaemenids, they did so not from royal inscriptions, but from these quiet documents. Reflections, the empire that taught us to organize. The Achaemenid Persians understood something simple but profound. You cannot govern what you cannot record. Their empire did not just conquer, it coordinated. It harmonized languages, honored local traditions, and demanded accountability not through terror, but through procedure. They taught that an empire is not built on might alone, but on ledger lines, routine, and trust in systems. Their bureaucracy was far from perfect. Corruption existed, satraps rebelled, taxes were resented, but the foundation they laid endured through centuries. Today, we recognize that roads, postal systems, seals, census models, and provincial administration all bear the marks of Persian influence. But more than that, we inherit a quiet ideal, that the clerk, the scribe, the seal-bearer, and the archivist are not peripheral to history, they are its architects. So when we think of the empire of Darius and Xerxes, let us think not just of columns and gold, but of scrolls in the sand fluttering briefly before disappearing, leaving only clay behind. Story 5. The Counting Houses of Athens. Democracies, forgotten accountants. You imagine Athens, 5th century BCE, a city of white marble, chattering citizens, bustling markets, and public debates under the open sun. Philosophers walk and talk, orators declaim, democracy flourishes. But beneath the shining facade of the Athenian polis is something less romantic, more ordinary and utterly essential. A man sits behind a desk made of rough wood in a room cooled by stone. He dips a reed into ink and begins transcribing numbers onto a thin wax tablet. His task is not to craft philosophy or propose laws. He is recording the grain stock in a state granary. He does not speak in the assembly, he tallies it. He is a legistes, an Athenian public accountant, and without him and thousands like him, democracy could not function. While Athenian democracy gave the world a model of civic participation, what truly sustained it was something else: administrative rigor. Beneath every speech and vote were auditors, registrars, clerks, and recorders. These were the city's hidden workers, the bureaucrats of freedom. Let us begin with the truth that often goes unspoken in civic myth. Democracy runs on paperwork. A direct democracy, administered indirectly. Athenian democracy in the 5th century BCE was both revolutionary and complex. Citizens, adult males with native-born parents, participated directly in political decisions. They could vote on laws, serve on juries, and be selected by lot for civic office. Yet with a citizen population of roughly 30,000 to 40,000, and a total population over 250,000 including women, children, and enslaved people, administration required more than participation. It required structure. Though Athens did not have a professional civil service like Persia or China, it developed a robust bureaucracy comprised of rotating office holders, specialized boards, and full-time public functionaries. Some officials were chosen by lot to prevent corruption or dominance by elites. Others, particularly financial officers, were elected requiring both trustworthiness and expertise. Among these roles, the logistai, apodtai, and tamiai were critical. The logistai, state auditors. The logistai, lambda omicron gamma iota sigma tau alpha iota, were public auditors, typically 10 in number, one for each of the Athenian tribes. Their job: reviewing the accounts of outgoing magistrates, auditing state expenditures, and ensuring no funds were misused, preparing summary financial reports for the assembly, bringing charges against officials who misappropriated funds. Each year, hundreds of citizens cycled through public offices. These posts often involved managing money, overseeing markets, organizing festivals, supervising naval construction. But every outgoing official had to submit accounts to the logistai. If errors or fraud were found, the logistai could initiate legal proceedings. Citizens who had served dishonestly might be fined, banned from office, or even stripped of civic rights. In this way, the logistai functioned as guardians of public trust. They were not elected for brilliance, they were elected for integrity. The apogtai, collectors and distributors. Another key body were the apogtai, letter 1F00 pi omicron delta epsilon kappa tau alpha iota, officials responsible for receiving public revenues, managing taxation, and recording payments. There were 10 apogtai again, one per tribe, and they performed tasks we might associate with a modern treasury department. Collecting tributes from allies in the Delian League. Overseeing direct taxes, though rare in Athens. Recording liturgies, mandatory public services for wealthy citizens. Disbursing funds to state contractors, religious festivals, or the military. Every transaction they recorded was documented, reviewed by other officials, and ultimately made available to the assembly. Some of their records were inscribed on stone stelae and placed in public, an early form of transparent governance. This commitment to recorded accountability was central to Athenian political life. It was not enough to accuse someone of theft, you had to show the numbers. The tamiai, treasurers of temples and state. The tamiai, tau alpha mu iota alpha iota, were treasurers, some attached to specific institutions, like the treasury of Athena, others responsible for broader state finances. Their roles included guarding public funds stored in temples, funding public works, especially during Periclean building campaigns, disbursing wages to jurors, soldiers, and festival participants, managing foreign tribute accounts. These treasurers were often drawn from wealthy families, those with skin in the game, whose reputation and assets acted as collateral for good behavior. Inscriptions from the Parthenon building project list exact amounts of marble purchased, tools acquired, workers paid, and deadlines met. These records weren't just internal. They were etched into stone, available for any literate citizen to read. It was bureaucracy, as public performance accountability made architectural. Registers, lists, and lots, managing participation. Aside from finance, Athenian bureaucracy was deeply involved in maintaining civic lists. The demes, local districts, kept citizen registers, listing those eligible to vote or serve. Lot machines, kleroteria, were used to randomly assign citizens to juries or offices. Courts were filled daily through randomized selection, with names recorded and tokens issued. Public buildings displayed lists of office holders, honors awarded, and legal decisions. This constant record-keeping made participation both possible and verifiable. It also helped prevent fraud. A citizen trying to vote in the assembly had to appear on the deme register. An elected official needed to pass a dokimasia, a vetting process where records were examined to ensure eligibility. Slave bureaucrats and permanent functionaries. Unlike the rotating citizen magistrates, some administrative posts were permanent, held by skilled professionals. Surprisingly, many of these were public slaves, demosioi, owned by the city and trained for specific tasks. Clerks who recorded assembly minutes, secretaries who maintained archives and correspondence, court attendants who managed case files and ballots, tallymen who counted votes and recorded trial outcomes. These public slaves ensured continuity in a system that relied on rapid turnover of elected officials. They were experts, though not citizens, and their knowledge often surpassed that of their elected supervisors. They are history's forgotten professionals, men who could not vote, yet enabled democracy to function. Athens may have praised its orators, but it survived on its clerks. And still we must ask, in a system where thousands of accounts were kept, lists compiled, and records inscribed in stone, what did the average citizen understand? Did they trust the numbers, or merely the people who made them? You stand before a tall marble stele in the Athenian agora. The sun bleaches its inscriptions, yet the chiseled text is still clear. Lists of names, figures, and allocations. It is a public record of tribute, the payments received from Athens' allies in the Delian League. This is not a monument to a general or a god. It is a monument to accounting. In democratic Athens, public money was not hidden. It was declared. Financial data was a civic concern, and fiscal transparency was a political tool. Every expenditure, whether for warships, festivals, or jurors' wages, passed through the hands of bureaucrats, often with oversight by multiple boards and committees. Let us now look more closely at how democracy was funded, monitored, and ultimately debated through its bureaucracy. The Delian League and the Treasury of Athena. Following the Persian Wars, Athens founded the Delian League, a coalition ostensibly formed to defend against Persian aggression. Member states contributed ships, soldiers, or tribute payments. Over time, these tributes shifted from military resources to regular monetary payments, and Athens began to manage them centrally. Initially, the League's treasury was located on Delos, a sacred island. But by the 450s BCE, Athens transferred it to the Acropolis, placing it under the protection of Athena's temple and, not coincidentally, under Athenian control. Who managed this enormous influx of funds? The Tamii of Athena were responsible for the treasury. The Logistai audited their accounts annually. The Boule Council and Ecclesia Assembly voted on disbursements. Records were kept and inscribed in stone, often at public expense. One surviving inscription from the 440s BCE records payments made to Athens by subject allies, broken down by polis, in drachmae and talents. These were not symbolic numbers. They were official accounting documents, displayed as a form of political legitimacy. It sent a clear message: we know what you paid, and so does everyone else. State pay and the politics of participation. Athenian democracy was time-consuming. Attending the assembly, serving on juries, or fulfilling liturgies took citizens away from their farms or shops. To make participation possible, Athens began offering state pay for civic service. Jurors were paid a daily wage, initially 2 obols, later increased. Assembly attendees were paid a stipend by the late 5th century. Archons and officials received modest salaries. Festival participants, such as chorus members, were compensated. Rowers in the Navy, drawn largely from poorer citizens, earned steady pay. These payments were recorded, overseen by a pogtai, and funded through the tribute system and other state revenues, such as silver from the Laurian mines. Critics, like Aristotle in Politics, feared that pay might encourage dependency or demagoguery, citizens voting for benefits rather than the common good. But others argued it was essential to equality. Without compensation, only the wealthy could afford civic duty. Thus, the bureaucracy didn't just manage democracy. It enabled it by converting ideology into accessible, salaried participation. Liturgy and private funding of public goods. Another Athenian innovation was the system of liturgies, lambda epsilon iota tau omicron upsilon rho gamma iota alpha iota, public services performed and funded by wealthy citizens. Liturgies included Chorgia, financing dramatic choruses for festivals; Trierarchia, outfitting and commanding a worship; Gymnasiarchia, paying for athletic training and games; Hestiaces, sponsoring public feasts. The state kept lists of eligible citizens, and liturgies were assigned often rotationally. Rich citizens could attempt to avoid liturgy by claiming someone else was wealthier and should serve instead, leading to legal contests known as antidosis. The logistai and apogtai monitored these obligations, and while some citizens grumbled, many competed for prestige. A well-funded liturgy brought honor and influence, a private expense turned into public capital. Thus, even in a democracy, social distinction was bureaucratically organized. Infrastructure, military, and the bureaucracy of war. The Athenian navy, heart of its imperial power, was a logistical masterpiece. Each trireme required 200 crew members, rations for long campaigns, shipwrights and maintenance, naval pay, recorded by officials known as trierarchs. The tamii of the navy, distinct from temple treasurers, tracked ship repairs, expenses, and even rower attendance. Muster rolls and salary records helped ensure funds were not wasted or stolen. During the Peloponnesian War, this bureaucratic structure was strained. Emergency levies, shifting alliances, and declining tribute revenues forced the city to restructure its finances multiple times. Still, the records endured. In the Athens tribute lists, some city names are scratched out, signs of rebellion or default. Others are followed by notations, paid in part, did not send delegate, under review. These were not punishments, they were fiscal footnotes, carefully carved for the scrutiny of future assemblies. Accountability and the end of office. When an Athenian magistrate left office, he underwent an euthanae, a public review of his performance and finances. During the euthanae, citizens could bring formal charges of misconduct, negligence, or theft. Auditors, the logistai, compared declared funds with actual expenditures. Documentation was crucial. Some accused officials presented receipts and witnesses, duplicate records from clerks or public slaves, stone inscriptions or copies kept at temples. The process was not always fair. Popular officials might be shielded, and enemies framed, but it was part of a culture of visible, recorded accountability. No officeholder escaped without scrutiny. The fragility of the system. Despite its transparency, Athenian bureaucracy had weaknesses. Lack of centralization, with duties divided across dozens of temporary officials. Dependence on part-time citizens who might lack expertise. Gaps in continuity, as many positions rotated annually. Public slaves, though skilled, could not act independently. When under stress, such as during the oligarchic coups of 411 and 404 BCE, or following military disasters, the system frayed. Financial mismanagement, political purges, and lost records disrupted the flow of governance. In the later 4th century BCE, reforms under Eubulus and others tried to restore balance, reallocating funds, reorganizing oversight, but the writing was on the steel. Democracy would falter and eventually fall under Macedonian hegemony. Still, the bureaucratic memory lingered. In the end, Athens left us not only philosophy and plays, but paperwork preserved in stone, copied by hand, and quietly echoed in every modern tax roll and trial transcript. Yet one wonders, did the clerks, those who wrote the records, counted the coins, and etched the lists, feel a part of democracy's story? Or did they simply do their jobs, unaware that history would someday read their figures as civic poetry. The wind carries dust across the Phoenix. The Assembly Hill stands quiet now, its rostrum empty, its stones worn smooth by centuries of feet. But once, thousands gathered here, citizens arguing, applauding, voting. And nearby, in dim rooms and shaded porticos, a different kind of labor continued, not spoken aloud, but written. This final section follows the afterlife of the Athenian bureaucracy, how it endured through turmoil, inspired future governments, and carved itself quite literally into the memory of history. Athens, democracy is often praised for its ideals, but it is time to consider the apparatus that made those ideals livable. Not the roar of the demos, but the rustle of scrolls. From stele to state, inscriptions as bureaucratic memory. Walk the Athenian agora or the Acropolis slopes and you will find them, long slabs of stone, upright like sentinels. To the casual observer they seem merely decorative, but these are not statues, they are documents, and they formed a key part of Athenian public administration. Stone inscriptions, especially from the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, served as a visible archive. They included tribute lists from the Delian League, honorary decrees for foreign envoys or benefactors, public accounts for building projects, legal summaries, including amnesty laws and constitutional reforms, lists of citizens, judges, or festival participants. These were not symbolic gestures. They were active administrative tools. They functioned like public notice boards and fiscal audits, placed in shared spaces like temples or stoas. Consider the accounts of the Parthenon, inscribed over several years. They detail the costs of marble, salaries for craftsmen, gold reserves held in the treasury, and monthly updates reviewed and displayed by the Tamii of Athena. This tradition of making the state visible through stone shaped how Athenians perceived civic life, not as hidden or mystified, but as participatory and inspectable. The bureaucracy after democracy. By the late 4th century BCE, Athenian democracy had begun to fray. Military defeats, economic pressures, and Macedonian interference chipped away at autonomy. Yet even as democratic mechanisms weakened, the bureaucratic skeleton remained intact. The assembly continued to meet, though with less authority. The Bull Council still reviewed expenditures. Magistrates still underwent audits. Inscriptions continued to be carved, documenting honors, payments, and decrees. Even during the Roman occupation, beginning in 146 BCE, the Athenians retained local administrative practices. Roman governors consulted Athenian records. Temples continued to serve as treasuries. The citizen roles were still maintained. Athens had lost its empire, but not its accounting spirit, administrative culture, and philosophical critique. While Athens celebrated its bureaucratic thoroughness, not all citizens admired it. Plato, in the Republic, criticized democracy for being disordered and ruled by unqualified officials. His disdain extended to bureaucratic processes, which he saw as symptoms of a fragmented society. Aristotle, more practical, acknowledged the need for civic administration, but stressed the importance of education and virtue in office holders. He feared that too much reliance on procedure might lead to rigid formalism where rules trumped reason. Nonetheless, even these critics could not deny that democracy requires infrastructure. The philosopher might argue in the agora, but if the festival chorus isn't paid, if the jurors don't receive their obols, if the assembly can't verify tribute payments, democracy falters. And that infrastructure was managed by clerks and lists, not ideals. The Athenian legacy in later civilizations. The influence of Athenian bureaucracy stretched far beyond Greece. The Hellenistic kingdoms, especially in Egypt under the Ptolemies, adopted and expanded Athenian administrative practices. Civic offices, audits, temple treasuries and liturgical service were formalized and layered with Greek and Egyptian traditions. Rome, too, absorbed much from Athens. The Roman cursus honorum, ladder of offices, resembled Athenian rotation of magistracies. Roman record-keeping practices, especially in municipal governance, reflected Greek models. The public display of laws and budgets continued in Roman fora and basilicas. The idea that transparency legitimizes rule etched in marble persisted. Even in early Christian and Byzantine contexts, the fusion of bureaucracy and civic religion seen in Athens re-emerged, with bishops and deacons taking on roles once filled by logistai and tamii. The quiet workers of democracy. We remember Pericles for his speeches, Socrates for his questions, and Aristophanes for his comedies. But we forget the ones who tallied the cost of the Parthenon or registered jurors for the courts. Their names, if recorded at all, are buried in accounting lines. Paid to Cleon for marble transport. Supervised by Nicratos, clerk to the logistai. Verified by Euxithios, tamias of Athena. They weren't citizens giving speeches. They were public slaves, temporary appointees, and volunteer secretaries, men whose job was to ensure that the machinery of democracy kept running. Their impact wasn't dramatic, it was procedural, and that is precisely why it worked. The stone speaks. In the end, Athens taught us something profound. Democracy is not merely a system of rights. It is a logistical achievement. It is the coordination of data, money, people, and time. It is a network of inputs and outputs managed by individuals most will never know. And though the democracy of Athens eventually fell, its methods, its tools, titles, accounting habits, and commitment to civic transparency survived in law codes, government manuals, and even architectural design. In every courthouse, every civil service exam, every city ledger there is a trace of Athens. Perhaps this is the true legacy of Athenian democracy, not just the vote, but the receipt, not just the ideal, but the tally of what it cost to make it real. Story 6. Censors and senators' administrative machinery in Republican Rome. In the Roman Republic, power resided with the people. At least that was the claim. Citizens assembled in the forum to vote, magistrates wore the toga pretexted to symbolize civic authority, and consuls led the armies in the name of the Republic. But behind the grandeur of the Republic's rhetoric was a deeply entrenched machine of control, a system of cataloging, ranking, taxing, and regulating Roman life. And at the center of it all stood a man silent, stern and strangely powerful, holding a stylus and a wax tablet. He was the censor. Not a judge, not a priest, not a general, but an accountant of citizens, an inspector of morals, a manager of state contracts, appointed rarely with a term of 18 months and yet feared more than most annual magistrates. He could determine your place in society, exclude you from the Senate, and mark your name with infamy. This was no mere bureaucrat. This was the man who counted Rome and in counting it, shaped it. The origins of the census. The Latin word census is related to censor, to assess, or to appraise. In early Rome, this function began simply, a headcount of citizens for tax and military purposes. But the Roman census was never just demographic, it was hierarchical. By the 6th century BCE, under the legendary King Servius Tullius, Roman society had already begun organizing citizens into centuries based on wealth. This formed the basis for the comitia centuriata, the most powerful voting assembly. To vote, to serve, to pay, to benefit, all of it depended on where you stood in the census. And so, every 5 years, citizens gathered in the Campus Martius, the field of Mars, to be registered. One by one, they stood before the censors and declared their full name, their family lineage, their domicile, their property and wealth, their dependents. their slaves, their arms and armor for military classification, and if relevant their past conduct. It was a public act of submission, an individual declaring his worth, his obligations, and his right to participate in the republic. The role and powers of the censor. The office of censor was established formally in 443 BCE during the early republic, as the need for impartial record-keeping became apparent. 2 censors were elected, typically former consuls, and tasked with duties both numerical and moral. Their responsibilities included conducting the census, recording all male citizens and their property, assigning classes, grouping citizens into property-based voting blocks, reviewing Senate membership, removing unworthy senators, administering the public morality, mores, penalizing immorality or dishonorable behavior, managing state contracts, publicani, leasing public lands, roads, and tax farming rights. Importantly, censors had no military command and no judicial authority, yet they could brand a citizen with infamia, a permanent social stain. Cato the Elder, perhaps the most famous censor, once expelled a senator for publicly kissing his wife, a gesture he deemed too effeminate. Such was the power of reputation in a society built on status. The census as a tool of control. While the census was ostensibly about fairness, ensuring taxes and military service were proportionate, it also served as a method of ideological enforcement. The mores maiorum, or customs of the ancestors, were unwritten societal expectations. Censors interpreted and enforced these values, sometimes reducing a citizen's class, striking him from the rolls, or barring him from contracts. This wasn't about breaking laws. It was about violating Roman decorum. A man might be punished for failing to serve in the legions, spending too extravagantly, engaging in gladiatorial shows, public drunkenness, fraud in tax declarations, refusing to support aging parents. And these judgments were not appealed in court. They were administrative verdicts etched into the citizen rolls. In this way, the Roman Republic governed not just through law, but through bureaucratic shame. The infrastructure of the census. To carry out this massive administrative task, censors required support. Tabularii, or record keepers, maintained the citizen lists. Clerks from lower classes compiled land records and copied archives. Heralds called out names and summoned citizens to register. Statistical summaries were carved onto bronze tablets and stored in temples or archives like the tabularium. Servi publici, or public slaves, assisted with document handling. The numbers were staggering. By the late Republic, over 400,000 male citizens could be listed, and that did not include women, children, or non-citizen residents. The Roman state kept track of its people with obsessive detail, a feat not repeated at such scale until early modern Europe. A republic built on paper and bronze. Though much of Rome's history is preserved in epic literature, law codes, and architecture, the bureaucratic core of the republic is often overlooked. But the Romans understood, better than most, that power needs structure. They counted, filed, codified, contracted, and assessed everything from grain distribution to water rights. The aerarium, Rome's treasury, stored ledgers, tributes, and consular records. Quaestors, the republic's junior financial officers, managed accounts and expenditures. The Annals Maximi, a year-by-year record kept by the Pontifex Maximus, logged major events. The census rolls were updated, reviewed, and sometimes purged as Rome's politics shifted. In times of crisis, these archives were political weapons. Lists could be doctored, names removed, whole classes demoted. But in times of stability, they served something nobler, a shared civic memory. And yet one wonders, in a system so invested in nomming, ranking, and regulating its citizens, What space was left for dissent, for the anonymous, for the poor and invisible? When every Roman had a place fixed by class, by wealth, by censors decree what happened when the tables turned and the republic unraveled? The answer lies ahead. In a bustling port city of the Roman Republic, the Forum hums with a different kind of business. Not senators debating laws, nor consuls issuing orders, but contractors negotiating leases, tax rights, and construction tenders. A well-dressed man reads aloud the terms of a state contract, while another jots notes on a wax tablet. A group gathers, their togas whispering against the flagstones. These are not politicians. They are publicani, members of private syndicates managing public business. Rome's bureaucracy, despite its growing size and power, was remarkably lean. The city did not develop a vast class of career bureaucrats. Instead, it outsourced much of its administrative machinery to private enterprise, a network of tax farmers, toll collectors, construction firms, and suppliers who executed the state's will for a profit. Welcome to the world of privatized administration in the Roman Republic, a world that brought both immense efficiency and chronic corruption. Who were the publicani? The term publicani derives from publicum, meaning that which belongs to the public. Publicani were individuals, or, more often, members of societates publicanorum, corporations that bid on state contracts to handle tax collection in provinces, toll collection on roads, harbors, and markets, construction and maintenance of public works, aqueducts, temples, roads, supplying armies with food, equipment, or animals, managing mines and state lands. These syndicates operated much like modern corporations. They had investors, known as socii. They were managed by directors, the magister societatis. They employed clerks, accountants, agents, and enforcers. They submitted bids to the censors, who granted contracts at public auctions. And though the Republic viewed such outsourcing as practical, it also introduced a unique administrative tension: public function performed by private interest. The auction of the state. Every 5 years, when the censors were elected, a wave of activity swept through Rome. In the Atrium Libertatis, or later in the Forum, the censors would conduct public auctions of state contracts. A province like Asia Minor or Sicily might be offered for tax farming, a system where the winning syndicate paid a lump sum to the state, then collected taxes directly from the province's inhabitants. Whoever offered the highest guaranteed payment, often millions of sesterces, received the contract. It was an efficient system, at least on paper. The state got predictable revenue. The publicani shouldered the risk. But that risk came with motivation. To make a profit, publicani had to extract more from the provinces than they paid in. This led to aggressive collection practices, bribery of local officials, fabrication of debts, harsh penalties for delay. To many provincials, the publicanus was more feared than the Roman magistrate. The administrative web. Though based in Rome, publicani operated across the Mediterranean. They maintained a complex bureaucratic network. Regional offices in provincial capitals, accountants tracking tax quotas and deliveries, couriers delivering financial statements back to Rome, local agents who understood regional dialects and customs, ledgers, contracts, and receipts copied in triplicate and stored for audit. The censors, meanwhile, oversaw the integrity of the system from Rome. They reviewed bids, accepted sureties, and imposed fines. They investigated complaints and could invalidate contracts for misconduct. They maintained a record of trustworthy versus blacklisted syndicates. But in truth, as the Republic grew, the oversight mechanism strained under the scale. Rome's reliance on ad hoc check citizen juries, audits by quaestors, or appeals to the Senate was often too slow to keep up with abuse in distant provinces. senators, equestrians, and the profit of governance. A crucial social divide shaped this system. By law, senators were barred from participating in large-scale public contracting. To engage in such commerce was seen as beneath the dignity of the republic's elite lawmakers. Instead, it was the equites, the Roman knight class, who filled the role. Often wealthy, educated, and ambitious, equites formed the backbone of the publicani syndicates. This created a mutual dependency. Senators made policy, assigned provinces, and passed tax laws. Equites profited by executing those policies, then financing senators' political campaigns or supplying their military expeditions. It was not quite collusion, but it was a well-greased machine. Cicero, himself an equestrian and magistrate, often navigated this world. He both defended the publicani and criticized their excesses. In his speeches, we hear echoes of a familiar complaint: the state grows rich, but at what moral cost? The repercussions in the provinces. From Gaul to Judea, the name publicanus became synonymous with exploitation. In the Gospels, tax collectors are reviled figures not because taxation was inherently evil, but because of the abusive system that Rome allowed to flourish. Provincial governors, tasked with maintaining peace, often clashed with publicani. Bribes, extortion, and even violence were common tools. And yet, these same publicani made Roman administration feasible. Without them, Rome could not have financed military garrisons in far-flung regions, road and aqueduct construction, shipbuilding and grain supply for the capital, salaries for officials and upkeep of temples. They were the unofficial civil service of the late Republic. Cracks in the system. By the late 2nd century BCE, the relationship between the Senate, publicani, and provincial administration became a flashpoint of political debate. The Gracchi brothers sought reforms to limit exploitation. Gaius Gracchus, in particular, transferred judicial powers over provincial abuses from senators to equestrians, a move that gave publicani more legal immunity. Later, Julius Caesar would attempt to reform tax farming, opting instead for direct collection in some provinces. Under the empire, Augustus gradually replaced publicani with imperial procurators, salaried officials loyal to the emperor. Even so, echoes of the Republic's administrative DNA remained. The reliance on outsourced labor, the intertwining of commerce and governance, the dual-class structure of oversight all persisted in some form. So what did Rome teach us? That bureaucracy need not be faceless, that sometimes it wears a toga or carries an abacus. But it also taught that when public service becomes too profitable, when the balance between duty and enrichment tilts, even the best-intentioned systems can corrode from within. As the Republic marched toward civil war, these cracks widened. Was it Caesar's ambition that doomed the Republic? Or was it, perhaps, a contract signed 5 years prior to collect taxes in Asia? The Republic ended not with a single assassination or a decisive battle, but with a slow, grinding transformation, a gradual erosion of trust, accountability, and shared norms. And beneath the sweeping narrative of civil wars, triumvirates, and emperors in waiting, another transformation was taking place, quieter but no less profound. The Roman bureaucracy, long reliant on publicani, aristocratic oversight, and intermittent reform, was being reimagined. What had once been civic duty, executed by volunteers and competitive contractors, was becoming centralized administration. The ledger, once managed by a dozen equestrian syndicates, was being drawn into the imperial archive. The Republic had counted its citizens, taxed its provinces, and contracted its infrastructure through dispersed, competitive, and occasionally corrupt mechanisms. But now, in the late 1st century BCE, that system could no longer withstand the pressure. Rome didn't just lose a republic, it lost an ideology of administration. Bureaucracy under strain, Late Republican turmoil. By the time Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49 BCE, the bureaucratic apparatus of the Republic had already been overburdened. Tax farmers were becoming too powerful, influencing Senate votes and provincial governance. Governors were increasingly autonomous, managing provinces as private fiefdoms. Censors, once respected, were now often bypassed or left unappointed for decades. Contracts were rife with graft, and some syndicates failed to deliver on public works. Political trials over mismanagement became spectacles, with record books weaponized in court. In his role as both general and reformer, Caesar recognized that Rome's growth had outpaced its institutions. His reforms, while many were short-lived due to his assassination, included census standardization, including a more accurate count of citizens, attempted caps on tax farming abuses, direct appointment of officials to manage contracts, proposals to limit privatized bureaucracy in favor of state control. But his vision of reform came hand in hand with authoritarian control. He sought to rebuild the Republic's machinery, but with himself as its sole engineer. The death of the censor and the rise of central records. After Caesar's death and the subsequent chaos of the Second Triumvirate, Augustus Octavian took power and did something that Rome had never seen before. He built a centralized state bureaucracy. The office of the censor, once revered, was never again restored to its republican prominence. Instead, Augustus assumed the role of princeps senatus, controlling Senate membership directly, conducted the census personally, delegating the task to imperial agents, appointed procurators to manage state finances and contracts, created the fiscus, a new imperial treasury distinct from the Senate's aerarium, established permanent record offices, the beginnings of a civil service. By consolidating the various bureaucratic roles under his own supervision, Augustus turned what had been a rotating system of elected and outsourced authority into a career-based imperial service. Power no longer came from being elected by citizens or contracted by censors. It came from imperial appointment. The end of the publicani system. Though equestrian publicani still existed under Augustus and later emperors, their power was significantly reduced. Tax collection in the provinces shifted to imperial agents, many of whom were salaried and under tighter control. The abuses that had led to unrest, such as in Judea or Gaul, became unacceptable in an empire that prioritized stability over profits. State supply chains, military provisioning, and infrastructure increasingly relied on imperial bureaucracy, not syndicates. Over time, the publicani faded into the background, still present, but no longer the driving force of Roman administration. In their place stood a growing class of imperial administrators, trained and promoted through the cursus publicus, Rome's civil service. The Republic had managed governance with part-time magistrates and entrepreneurial contractors. The empire required full-time professionals. The archive and the emperor. Augustus and his successors understood that control was rooted not just in armies, but in information. The tabularium, Rome's official record office on the Capitoline Hill, was expanded and maintained as a hub of civic documentation. Census rolls were copied and stored. Decrees, edicts, and laws were archived. Property records, birth registers, and provincial reports were housed under lock and key. Access was tightly controlled. Only imperial officials could modify or publish them. This marked a departure from republican practice, where transparency and visibility were tools of legitimacy. Now, in the imperial era, secrecy and centralization became tools of control. The bureaucrat's inheritance. Despite the Republic's collapse, many of its bureaucratic innovations endured. Later empires, Roman, Byzantine, even modern European states adopted Roman principles of census-based taxation, property classification, and military obligation. Decentralized record-keeping tied to centralized oversight. A professionalized civil service drawn from elite and middle classes. The Roman model showed that empires could be held together not just with legions, but with ledgers. That maps, censuses, and contract rosters were as critical to stability as walls and garrisons. Even Rome's failures, such as its dependency on tax farmers, served as warnings to future administrators. In the ruins of the Republic's bureaucracy, later states found the seeds of rationalized governance. Reflections in stone and scroll. Today, fragments of Roman accounting tablets, census inscriptions, and contract clauses survive in dusty museum cases and archaeological sites. They are not grand declarations. They are records. Who paid what, who served where, who owned which field. These are the breadcrumbs of power. And in them, we glimpse the quiet force that kept Rome functioning until it could no longer hold. For it was not simply ambition that brought down the Republic. It was the slow, unaccounted-for drift between public duty and private profit, between civic service and factional interest, between shared administration and centralized rule. In the end, Rome reminds us that bureaucracy is not just paperwork. It is philosophy, discipline, and the architecture of society. And like all architecture, it must be maintained or it will collapse.